I moved to this dead-end town to bury the man I used to be, a man who lived by the gun and slept with one eye open. I thought my only problems were rusted bolts and quiet nights. I was wrong. When a silver Ferrari skidded into my lot with a terrified, silver-haired boy behind the wheel, my past and his future collided. He wasn't just a customer. He was Caspian Vance, the runaway heir to a billion-dollar empire. And the men hunting him, they didn't realize they weren't walking into a mechanic's shop. They were walking into a war zone. The rain in Blackwood didn't just fall. It punished the earth. It turned the red clay roads into slick traps and drowned the sound of everything except the steady, rhythmic clink of my wrench against a rusted manifold. I liked the rain. It kept people away. It kept the world quiet. And for a man like me, a man who had spent a decade as a cleaner for agencies that didn't exist, quiet was the only thing that kept the nightmares at bay. I was finishing up a rebuild on a local's tractor when the sound hit me. It wasn't the low chug of a diesel or the familiar rattle of a beat-up pickup. It was a high-pitched screaming whine of a precision-engineered Italian V12 being pushed far beyond its breaking point. I wiped my hands on a grease-stained rag and looked toward the open bay door. A silver Ferrari 812 Superfast skidded into my gravel lot, its engine coughing out a final pathetic plume of white smoke before dying right under my Max Repairs sign. Great, I muttered, my voice a low rumble. More drama. I didn't move. I waited. In my experience, people who drove cars that cost more than this entire town were usually looking for a miracle or someone to yell at. The door opened and a boy stepped out. That was the only word for him, boy. He looked barely 20, with silver blonde hair that was plastered to his forehead by the rain, and skin so pale it was almost translucent. He was wearing a gray cashmere coat that was currently soaked through, looking like a drowned bird. "We're closed," I called out, my voice flat. "Gas station is 5 miles north." He didn't move. He stood there, his chest heaving, his eyes wide and unfocused. Then he looked at me. His eyes were the color of the storm clouds behind him, gray, turbulent, and filled with a terror so sharp it made the hair on the back of my neck stand up.
"Please," he whispered. It wasn't a request, it was a prayer. I just needed to go. Just 50 more miles.
"Kid, that engine is fused," I said, stepping out from the shadows of the garage. "I'm 6'4", 230 pounds of solid muscle and bad intentions. Most people take one look at my scars and my beard and decide to find another mechanic." He didn't flinch. If anything, he moved toward me. "I'll pay you," he said, fumbling with a wallet that looked like it was made of embossed alligator skin. He pulled out a wad of hundreds, his fingers shaking so violently the bills fell into the mud. "Please, just get me away from the road." I looked at the money, then back at his face. That was when I saw it. A faint yellowish bruise along his jawline, and the way his sleeve had ridden up to reveal a red, raw ring around his wrist. Someone had been holding him down. "Inside," I growled, grabbing the collar of his expensive coat and hauling him into the dry heat of the garage. I kicked the bay door shut and dropped the heavy steel bolt. The sound of the lock engaging seemed to be the only thing that let the air back into his lungs. He collapsed onto my old wooden stool, his head dropping into his hands. "What's your name, kid?" I asked, leaning against my workbench and crossing my arms. He hesitated, his shoulders tensing. "Caspian. Just Caspian." "Funny," I said, picking up a tablet from the bench and tapping the screen. A news notification had popped up an hour ago. "Missing. Caspian Vance, heir to Vance Tech Industries. Last seen in Chicago. Family fears kidnapping." You look a lot like a billionaire's son who's supposed to be in a boardroom, not a grease pit in the middle of nowhere." Caspian froze. He looked up at me, his lip trembling. "Are you going to call them?" "I don't like the police," I said truthfully, "and I like billionaires even less. But I also don't like people bringing heat to my door." "They're coming," he breathed, his eyes darting to the closed door. "My father, he doesn't want me back for love, Jaxen. He wants the encryption keys. I'm the only one who has them. If he finds me—" He choked on the words, a single tear carving a path through the grime on his face. Suddenly, a set of headlights swept across the frosted glass of the garage windows. A large, black SUV crawled past, moving with the slow, predatory gait of a hunter. Caspian went silent. Not the silence of someone being quiet, but the silence of a man who had learned how to disappear into the floorboards to survive. He slid off the stool and pressed his back against the cold brick wall, his eyes fixed on me, pleading. In that moment, I had a choice. I could hand him over, collect whatever massive reward was on his head, and go back to my quiet life. Or I could remember the man I used to be, the one who protected the weak from the monsters of the world. I felt the old, cold itch in my knuckles. The soldier was waking up. "Get in the back office," I whispered, my voice dropping into that lethal register that used to make grown men scream. "Get inside and don't breathe until I tell you to." "Jaxen! Go!" I watched him scramble into the back, his small frame disappearing into the shadows. I reached into the hidden compartment behind my tool chest and pulled out a heavy iron pipe and the 9mm I hadn't touched in 3 years. The SUV stopped. The gravel crunched under heavy boots. 2 men, built like brick walls and wearing earpieces, stepped up to my door. They didn't knock, they hammered. "Max Repairs, open up. We're looking for a stalled vehicle." I took a deep breath, the scent of oil and adrenaline filling my lungs. I looked at the office door, where the most delicate thing I'd ever seen was hiding. "I'm closed," I yelled back, stepping toward the door with the pipe in plain sight, "and I don't like trespassers." The hunt had begun, but they didn't realize they weren't hunting a deer anymore. They were walking into a wolf's den. The hammering on the garage door sounded like a death knell. I didn't look back at the office where Caspian was hiding. I couldn't. If I saw the look in those gray eyes one more time, I might lose my edge. And right now, I needed to be as sharp as a razor. I didn't reach for the 9mm, not yet. In a town like Blackwood, a gunshot brings every nosy neighbor to their porch. I gripped the heavy iron pipe instead, feeling the cold weight of it. "I told you we're closed," I shouted, my voice echoing off the corrugated metal walls. I walked to the door and slid the small viewing hatch open. 2 men stood there. They looked like they'd been grown in a lab for billionaire security. Identical black suits, buzz cuts, and that dead look in their eyes that only comes from being paid to stop caring about morality. "Mr. Vane, we know the vehicle is here," the one on the left said. His voice was a calm, practiced monotone. "We just want the car and the passenger. There's a substantial finder's fee for your cooperation, $500,000, cash." I let out a low, dry chuckle. $500,000 to look the other way? You guys really want this kid. "He's a valuable asset to the Vance Corporation," the man replied. "Don't make this a local tragedy, Jaxen. We know your history. We know you're a man who likes his peace." My blood turned to ice. They'd done their homework. They knew I wasn't just a mechanic. They knew about the ghost who disappeared 3 years ago. "If you know my history," I growled, my hand tightening on the pipe, "then you know what happens when people step on my property without an invitation." I slammed the viewing hatch shut. 10 seconds, Vane," the man yelled through the steel.
I turned and sprinted toward the back office. Caspian was huddled under the desk, his knees pulled to his chest, his silver blonde hair a mess. He looked up at me, and for the first time, he didn't look like a spoiled heir. He looked like a human being who had been hunted for so long he had forgotten what it felt like to breathe. "They're not going away, are they?" he whispered. "No," I said, reaching down and grabbing his hand. His skin was ice cold. "But neither am I. Listen to me, Caspian. I'm going to open the back delivery door. There's an old Ford Bronco under a tarp in the alley. Get in, stay low. Do not start the engine until I tell you." "What about you?" I gave him a grim smile, the kind that used to terrify my targets. "I'm going to finish the repair." I pushed him toward the back exit, just as the front doors of the garage exploded off their hinges. A flashbang grenade bounced across the concrete floor, detonating in a blinding white light in a roar that felt like a physical blow to the head. I had my eyes closed before it hit. I moved in the darkness, a shadow among the machines I loved. The two suits stepped into the smoke, weapons drawn, suppressed barrels searching for a target. They expected a mechanic. They found a nightmare.
I came out from behind the Chevy engine block like a phantom. I swung the iron pipe with a brutal horizontal arc, catching the first man in the ribs. I heard the snap of bone over the ringing in my ears. He went down without a sound. The second man pivoted, his red laser sight dancing across the wall, but I was already under his guard. I grabbed his wrist, twisting it until the gun clattered to the floor and drove my forehead into his nose. The man staggered back, blood spraying his white shirt, but he was fast. He pulled a serrated combat knife from his belt and lunged. I felt the sting of the blade as it sliced through the bicep of my left arm, but I didn't flinch. Adrenaline is a hell of a drug. I caught his arm, spun him around, and slammed him face first into the heavy steel workbench. He slumped to the floor, unconscious. I stood there, gasping for air, blood dripping from my arm onto the grease-stained concrete. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the sound of the rain outside. "Jaxen?" Caspian was standing in the doorway of the office, his eyes wide with horror as he looked at the two bodies on the floor and the blood on my arm. "I told you to stay in the car," I rasped, leaning against the workbench. He didn't run. He didn't scream. He walked right up to me, tore a strip of fabric from his expensive silk shirt, and began to wrap it around my arm. His hands were shaking, but his grip was firm. "You fought them," he whispered, looking up at me. His gray eyes were shining with something that wasn't just fear anymore. It was awe. "You stayed." "I told you," I said, my voice softening as I looked down at him. "I fix things. And right now, you're the most broken thing in this shop." I looked out the shattered front door. There would be more of them. The Vance Empire didn't send 2 men and call it a day. They would send a small army. "We can't stay here," I said, grabbing my 9mm and a bag of supplies. "Blackwood isn't safe anymore." "Where are we going?" I looked at the old Ford Bronco waiting in the rain. Somewhere the world forgot. Somewhere ghosts go to stay hidden. As we ran toward the car, I felt Caspian's hand catch mine. It was a small, fragile connection, but in the middle of the storm, it felt like the only thing that mattered. I had spent 3 years trying to be a ghost, but this boy made me feel like a man again. The engine roared to life, and we tore out of the alley, leaving the burning remains of my quiet life behind. I didn't know where the road ended, but I knew one thing. If they wanted Caspian Vance, they were going to have to go through Jaxen Vane first. The tires of the Bronco screamed against the wet asphalt as we climbed higher into the Appalachian fog. Behind us, the lights of Blackwood vanished, swallowed by the trees in the dark. Beside me, Caspian was a statue of silk and terror. He hadn't said a word since we left the garage. He just stared out the window, his fingers digging into the worn leather of the passenger seat. I turned off the main highway onto a logging trail that didn't appear on any GPS. This was my fail-safe, a cabin built into the side of a ridge, surrounded by miles of thick brush and jagged rock. "We're almost there," I said,
my voice sounding louder than I intended in the cramped cabin of the truck. Caspian finally looked at me. The glow from the dashboard highlighted the sharp lines of his face and the dark bruise on his jaw. "Why are you doing this, Jaxen? You could have taken the money. You could have stayed safe." I kept my eyes on the trail. "I've had money, Caspian, and I've never been safe. Not really. Besides," I added, glancing at his trembling hands, "I don't like bullies." We reached the cabin an hour later. It was a rugged structure of cedar and stone, nearly invisible against the cliffside. I led him inside, the air smelling of pine and old wood smoke. Caspian stood in the center of the small room, looking completely out of place in his ruined designer clothes. He looked fragile, like he might shatter if the wind blew too hard. "Sit," I commanded gently, pointing to the hearth. "I'll get a fire going." As the flames began to lick at the dry logs, the room warmed. I grabbed a first aid kit and sat on the coffee table in front of him. My arm was still throbbing, the makeshift bandage he'd tied earlier soaked through with dark blood. "Let me," Caspian whispered. He took the kit from my hands.
I watched him. The way he moved was elegant, even now. He cleaned the knife wound with a steady hand, his brow furrowed in deep concentration. For a billionaire's son, he didn't flinch at the sight of the jagged red line across my bicep. "You've done this before," I noted. He paused, a shadow crossing his face. "My father's security team. They weren't always gentle during training. I learned young how to patch myself up so the staff wouldn't see the marks." The anger flared in my chest, a hot, protective burn. I reached out with my good arm and tipped his chin up so he had to look at me. "He'll never touch you again, I promise you that." Caspian's breath hitched. The distance between us felt like it was disappearing, swallowed by the heat of the fire and the weight of the silence. He didn't pull away. Instead, he leaned forward, resting his forehead against mine. "I spent my whole life being an asset, Jaxen," he breathed, his voice breaking. "To my father, to the board, to the world. You're the first person who saw me and didn't see a price tag." "I see you, Caspian," I whispered. I didn't think, I just moved. I covered his hand with mine and leaned in, closing the gap. The kiss was slow, hesitant at first, like he was waiting for the world to end. It tasted of salt and adrenaline, a desperate anchoring in the middle of a storm. He melted against me, his hands gripping the front of my shirt as if I were the only thing keeping him on the planet. I pulled him closer, my large frame shielding his smaller one, promising him with every touch that the ghosts of his past would have to go through me to get to him. We were miles from civilization, hunted by an empire with infinite resources. But in that cabin, under the shadow of the peaks, the world was finally quiet. "I'm not running anymore," Caspian whispered against my lips. "Good, because I'm done hiding."
The road ahead is dark, and the Vance Empire has more shadows than I have bullets. But as I look at Caspian sleeping by the fire, I know I'd burn the whole world down just to keep him safe. This is only the beginning of our survival. If you want to see if we make it past the next ridge, hit that subscribe button and turn on the bell for Gay Stories Chronicles. We're dropping the next chapter of Jaxen and Caspian's journey very soon, and you won't want to miss the moment the hunters finally catch up. Jaxen risked his entire life of peace the second he touched Caspian's car. If you were hiding a dangerous secret, would you trust a rugged stranger like Jaxen to protect you? Or would you keep running alone? Drop your answer in the comments below. I read every single one.